So good evening, everybody. I'm so glad to see a good turnout. This is a good turnout. And also on Zoom. So welcome to everybody. This is our Advent edition of our Rosary Gathering. And also we are marking St. Joseph. Conclusion of the year of St. Joseph is on the feast, the solemnity of the Immaculate Conception on the 8th of December. So we're going to just mark that this whole year of being accompanied by St. Joseph. And we have Tim Olsen today with us to help us do just that. He's going to talk to us about, give us a few thoughts and inspirations about St. Joseph. So wonderful children are so good to patiently be praying, and so amazing that they're the only ones praying during the year over here. So we should be happy about that. So Tim, I call you over. I have a little introduction about him. But before that, I want to tell you how we got introduced first, and it's because of I think it's because of being Indian or being. So he's from the Shoenstatt movement. He's a parishioner of Epiphany, and the Shoenstatt movement is an international Marian movement, and he might mention a little more about it. But the new chaplain, to make it easier for you to understand, the new chaplain they got is an Indian priest. He is up in Wisconsin, and because of that, Tim reached out to me and he said, you know, this priest is coming down, and if you'd like him to meet with your community, it would be a good thing. His name is Father Pushpa. So let's hope that it's in the will of God that we might have him sometime over. He's a very fine priest. So
he would love that.
What's that?
He would love that.
He would love that, yes. And he's from Tamil Nadu. And I don't know how he landed up with Shoenstatt, but that's God's. That's how God's ways are. So as I said, he's from the Epiphany Parish. Tim is a graduate of the University of Illinois. He has degrees in philosophy and political science, both of which I wish I had studied. And he's a graduate of ISU with a master's in applied computer science. So he was able to make this run for me. So at work, he's a software developer and an author of one of the most successful software platforms in modern medical research. He's a successful entrepreneur and leader in the international medical imaging community, and is currently Senior Vice President of Operations at a startup company, working with premier hospitals to implement new workflows to improve medical research and care. Together with his wife Molly, Tim leads the Shoenstatt movement in the Peoria Diocese. So the Shoenstatt, which operates from Epiphany, is actually covering the whole diocese, and assists in the leadership of the national movement of Shoenstatt, which is headquartered outside of Milwaukee, Wisconsin. So we welcome Tim Olsen.
Thanks. All right, very excited to be here. Let me get it here. I'm going to set a stopwatch that my wife isn't here to nudge me. Normally.
St. Joseph missing his voice now.
Exactly. Speaker mode. We'll see how this works. I just got this recently. See if that helps at all. I tend to be a soft talker.
Yeah, he does know.
Okay, good. Let's see how that goes. Let me know if you guys have trouble here. Try to adapt. So I'm Tim Olsen. I would say, all of that is kind of, that introduction is to give you a sense of why you might be interested to hear what I have to say. In my greatest calling, my greatest vocation is my marriage. Husband and a father. That's the way that I first and foremost live out my relationship with God, which of course is what all of our lives are about, right? And so that's what I would say. When I introduce myself, first thing I say is, Tim, I have 6 kids. We go to Epiphany Parish. Kids range from 17 to 2. I have 2 girls, 17, 16, and 3 boys, 13, 11, and 7. It's always a quiz. They keep changing their ages every year. And then the youngest is 2. So we have a 17-year-old and a 2. I'm a convert to the Catholic faith. At one point, I called myself an atheist. I was an atheist philosophy grad. Really, in reality, probably more of an agnostic, if you know the difference, but nonetheless, I had a very profound conversion to the faith. And was baptized at the Newman Center at ISU here in town, which is ironic because I went to U of I, and they have this beautiful, glorious Newman Center over there, one of the best, in the world. And I barely went there. I had roommates who went there and were well served by it. And then I came over here, and it was like it was before they remodeled it, so it was just like a warehouse. And that is where I found God in a very deep way, which I, of course, give great credit to my wife. Right? Often for hard-headed men like me, it takes the love of a good woman. Right? You guys are probably familiar with that. Lord reached out and asked if I'd be willing to come tonight and talk a bit about St. Joseph. And we are in the middle of moving from Normal to East Peoria. We bought a house over there. My two oldest daughters go to a high school over there, Chesterfield Academy at Sacred Heart. And seeing that we have kids all the way down to 2, I was like, wow, we will be driving over there for the next 18 years. Maybe we should just move a little closer. And Molly's family lives over there, so it's in some ways moved home. So we're in the middle of that. We'll be moved by the end of the month. In addition to that, we just sold my company that we built up. And so we're going through mergers and reorganizations and all of this stuff at work. It's just crazy, right? And so, I turned to Molly and said, well, they asked me to come and give a talk on St. Joseph. I've never given a talk on St. Joseph before, so I don't have any previous talks to steal from. Other, Christian marriage and a fatherhood. I've given talks on fatherhood and such. But specifically St. Joseph, I hadn't. So, oh goodness. And we prayed about it and said, if God calls, you answer. And so that's what I did. So as I reflected on it and said, okay, what would I say about St. Joseph? Right? What is he? What's his significance to me? And what do I think is important to share? And that's kind of where I focused at. One of the question I started at that I don't necessarily call out during the talk, but it really is kind of the guts of where I was coming from. And it's a continual question I'm always asking myself is, what is a Christian father? What does it mean to be a Christian father? And if St. Joseph to me is an answer to that, right? He obviously in his time didn't call himself a Christian, but he was the first man to follow Christ, right? And place chasing him around, right? So there's that aspect. The other thing that I dwell a lot on is how did Mary see Joseph? All right, and I'd ask that to the women in the audience. Think of your husband. There's how the outside world sees your husband, and then there's how you see your husband, right? And those are different. You know them in a much more personal way. You have all your inside jokes. You have all those common experiences. You have a very personal connection, a very personal relationship. And that was kind of part of what I was thinking. Wouldn't it be awesome if we could see part of that side of Joseph? Right? I'm from Shoenstatt. It's a Marian movement. Similar to you guys, we have a profound devotion to the Blessed Mother. And so that's what kind of drew me. It's like, well, how does Mary see Joseph? Who's Joseph? Who's Joseph for Mary? I also then started thinking about the notion of the family, because that is really where Joseph is called out, known through, right? It's through what he did through the Holy Family. And then we'll reflect a bit on the challenges that he faced in his life, the Jesus that he experienced, right? Which is different, I think, than what most of us have experienced, and then just what we can kind of take from it, what can we learn from it. So yeah, that's a bit of an introduction. I remember with the kids, I read these saint books, right? And I read them, and they're usually really good. But one of the complaints I sometimes have is that they make the saints seem a little too perfect. Sometimes they aren't exactly real characters, real people that you can say, yes, that's like me. And that's not why we have saints, right? We have saints specifically so that we can imitate. We can say, this is someone like me, and they did it, right? They did this, I can do it. Right? They're supposed to inspire us. And so that's a lot how I look at St. Joseph, especially as a father. So, what do you think of when you hear the name St. Joseph? Take a second and think of that. But what does that name bring to your mind when you hear it? Jesus is father, yes. Right? That's probably going to stick out. Mary's husband, yes. Right? We know these things. St. Joseph the worker, that's a common one too, right? Terror of demons, I particularly love that one, right? Pretty cool title to have. How about a man who had one of the most unique and awe-inspiring relationships with God? In all of human history, he had this very unique experience with God. We'll talk a bit about it. But he's not the first person I think of there. When I think of men with amazing relationships with God, I may think of Padre Pio or Francis of Assisi, or some of the great male saints over the years. Joseph isn't the first one I think of as the father of the worker, right? I don't think of him in terms of his relationship with God. I think that's a mistake. And yet, Joseph's relationship with God was incredible. Absolutely incredible. And unrepeatable. And that's what I want to reflect on tonight. You'll often hear that Catholic men should model themselves after St. Joseph, and I think usually what we mean there is fatherhood and being the worker, and of course those are very true. But I want to go a little deeper and say, what about that relationship with God? And say, isn't that the heart of what we should be modeling ourselves after? So first I wanted to start with some context. For me, I live in a much different world than St. Joseph did. And I assume you guys do too. Obviously it's different, from technology, right? And that's a lot of the effects that we see. So electricity and lights and cars and cell phones, right? Oh my gosh, he didn't have smartphones. How did he manage, right? So he also probably he had a much more traditional lifestyle, more of an agrarian style lifestyle, pre-industrial revolution. So that meant that he probably worked within a few feet of where he lived. Right? Back then, they didn't have cars to drive somewhere, so his office space was probably in his house, right? Or in the backyard. As I was thinking about that, I said, "Wow, it kind of reminds me of quarantine with COVID, right? When we were all stuck at home, and all the schooling happened at home, and all the work happened at home. That was what life was like for Joseph. So his life never really would have been that separate from the family. We would have been immersed in the family. So post-COVID, that's a little easier to maybe understand. The other thing is that in his time, gender roles would have been a lot more clearly defined, right? In our culture right now, gender roles, that's a hugely controversial thing, right? And even, those gender roles that were back then, 2,000 years ago, would have been considered pretty harsh in almost any modern family. Right? Women were often considered to be property, even in Jewish culture. They had very little control of their own lives, as it was said, when Mary was found to be pregnant. If she was found to have committed adultery, she would have been stoned to death. And that wouldn't have been a jury by her peers in court. That would have been more like mob rule, kind of whatever people thought. So a very different world in that dynamic. Men had all the power. And we can have our issues with that. I set those aside for a second and just recognize what that meant for Joseph. He had a tremendous amount of responsibility. Everything was on Joseph. When they had to go to Egypt, that was on Joseph. He had to figure out where they're going to be. He had to figure out how he could feed them. All of that experience was all of that responsibility was on Joseph. It's a tremendous weight that we should recognize. It wasn't a trivial task. So with that kind of fairly unchangeable society rules that they were in, and those gender roles that we can still have our issues with today, mothers were very obviously different than fathers. Hopefully they still are, but for some in our culture they get confused. more importantly, what I really wanted to focus on is the relationship with the child was different. It still is. We've found through our work in Shoenstatt, we founded 4 different couples groups, and we've ended up getting to know pretty closely about 50 different families, 50 different couples in our community. And it's very fascinating. And we talk a lot about gender roles. We talk about a lot being the mother and being the father, right? And it's very interesting in our day and age to do that. You learn a lot. And there's a lot of confusion, even in solidly Catholic families. There was a book, I remember back in I think it was the 80s or 90s, that men are from Mars and women are from Venus. And from what that was, you apply those now in those couples, and it's very often switched. The men are from Venus and the women are from Mars, which is fascinating. But that's another topic. But there are still some commonalities with how things used to work. For example, when we say, when you hear someone in a marriage say, don't coddle the children, or don't spoil them, or we need to toughen them up. In all those couples, even though the gender roles are confused, it's usually the dad saying that. It's usually that dad who has that more kind of stern disciplinarian perspective. If that makes sense. The mother, on the other hand, tends to be a little more forgiving, maybe more merciful. That's not, universally true, but just somewhat of a generalization. So personally, Molly definitely has, my wife, definitely has a way more nurturing side to her. She's very easy nurturing, and I'm very much more towards being a little too strict. Now, one of the ways I think of this, and one of the ways I understand it, is that she has this kind of more natural relationship. And a mother has a more natural connection with the child because she bore the child, because the child was born out of her. And that, whereas I, as a man, and Joseph, and any other man, has to work a little more at that relationship to build that connection. And so one thing I know and think of is that studies have shown that a child's blood is detectable within the mother's blood for decades after the baby is born, and vice versa. The mother's blood is present in the child's blood for decades, right? Theoretically, for their entire lives. That's the level of biological connection between a mother and the child, right? So a child is very literally flesh of her flesh. Right? For a man, that's not true, right? So it's just a natural biological difference there that is, on an instinctive level present. Beyond that, when a baby's born, especially back then, but even now, Molly was, I remember at one point, breastfeeding or pregnant for like 12 years straight without any break. And the effect of that was that she wasn't, if we'd been in a culture where I had to go out hunting or someone had to go out hunting for food, or someone had to build a house, she would likely not have been doing that, right? Because she was constantly nursing, constantly taking care of the baby who had to eat like every hour and a half, right? It's ridiculous. And so it was often on the father, which meant the mom, on top of having this biological connection with the child, also was always present with the child, whereas the dad was often going away and doing whatever needed to be done, right? So these are just kind of natural dynamics of the human family that I kind of wanted to put out there for context. So the mother couldn't stray from the child very far because the baby constantly needed it. And this would have led to a pretty natural difference in the relationship between the child with mom versus dad. And that would have been true for Mary and Joseph, right? The mom was always there and really flesh of the flesh, whereas dad would go away and be more separated, more distant, right? And the dad would have to naturally work on the relationship with the child. Like that comes as easily. I bring this up because this natural difference generally is the dad feeling a bit more detached and maybe not feeling as close to the child. I don't know if you guys have seen that dynamic in your marriages, but I've certainly seen it in a lot of our couples, that The mom has a very close relationship with the children, and the dad is much more distant. And whereas a mother's love is almost always a given, a father's love can feel a little less guaranteed, right? And as we look at our relationships with our own parents, we see that, right? What was my relationship like with my mom? What was my relationship like with my dad? The moments when a father connects in a loving way with a child can sometimes be rare, right? I think on this a lot. It influences a lot of how I think of the Blessed Mother, because for that traditional mother, one of the sweetest treats would have been those moments when she saw the child and the husband coming together in love, right? So you imagine, here's the man you dated, or however you guys ended up together, and he made a fool out of himself for you. He swallowed his pride. In the olden days, he used to like sing songs outside the window and that kind of stuff. I never had to do that, thankfully. But I, write poems and all these things that as men we don't typically do when we're dating. That's the kind of stuff that you actually get kind of do, right? But a man often wind up, showing his tender side in those early days of the relationships. The mom has that connection to the father. The child generally sees that discipline, strictness, right? Which is good for the child. I'm not saying in all that that's a bad, that we don't want to do that. It's important that we instill discipline, but it always needs to, in the end, be overcome by love. So that moment, those moments when, if the child feels maybe unloved by the dad sometimes, or he doesn't care about me, I'm never good enough for him, those kinds of thoughts. When those break down and the mother and the father and the child are united in love, to me, that would be like one of the sweetest moments for that mom, right? To see the child and the father coming together in love. I say that because to me, that is really how we see the Blessed Mother. For her, she is our mother, right? And one of the greatest moments for her is when we come together in love with our Father, who is God. Right? And so that is the highlight of her life. It's the purpose of her existence because it happens through Christ. Right? It's Christ who allows us to encounter the love of the Father. So this is at the heart really of our devotion to Mary in Shoenstatt, is that we want to acknowledge that and say, Mother, help me to go to him faster. You know what's wrong with me. You know the things where I'm stepping back. You know the ways where I'm hiding from my Father and not being open to him. Help me work on those. Bring me to the Father. So that these to me are some of the natural family dynamics which most traditional families would have had, and Joseph probably experienced. It's worth noting Joseph was technically more of a stepdad, maybe say foster father. Jesus was conceived with God and Mary. Joseph wasn't there. So as the father of the family, he likely would have struggled with some of that feeling of detachment, some of that feeling of separation. It's just my conjecture, but based on all the families I've seen, it seems pretty likely. Most fathers do. And Mary and Joseph would have been as close could be, right? Without even really trying. But Joseph would have had to work at it. Joseph would have had to build that relationship with Jesus. That must have been a very interesting dynamic. Mary was the Immaculate Conception, right? Jesus was God made flesh. And then there was Joseph. Just regular old Joseph, right? He's not the Immaculate Conception. He wasn't conceived without original sin. He certainly wasn't God made flesh. He wasn't perfect. And yet it was his job to be the protector and leader of the family. Such an interesting dynamic there, right? In fact, it's even recognized there, the angel, when the angel appears to Joseph and says, take your family to Egypt, it's like, why is she appearing to Joseph? It's the Immaculate Conception. Why not go to Jesus? And Jesus just jump up in his crib and say, we gotta go, right? Why? Because he was the leader of the family. He was a protector of the family. And even God and the angels recognized that and went to Joseph. It makes me wonder if he felt worthy of that. I wonder if he felt qualified for that. As a father, that's something I often struggle with, and I think a lot of other dads too. I don't often feel like I'm capable of being the dad that I need to be. As we were filling out our things, I didn't fill them out, but every time to be a better husband and father. And 20 years later, I'm still writing the same thing. I just often don't feel worthy of the task. Do you think Joseph might have felt that way too? In that situation where his wife is the Immaculate Conception and his child is God made flesh, I can see him being a little intimidated. Sure, he's from the house of David. Sure, angels had appeared to him, right? But in the moments of hardship, struggling to find a place in Egypt, struggling to find a place for the child to be born, struggling to know how to raise the Son of God. Don't you think he may have felt like maybe he wasn't quite good enough? Don't you think he might have had some of those doubts? Honestly, if I'd allowed one of our many children to be born in a barn, I don't think Molly ever would have let me hear the end of it. And I wouldn't be surprised at all if Mary gave him a hard time about it. And with some good reason. Right? I think this helps us to see some of the human experience of Joseph, that he was a human being like the rest of us. And in those moments that we struggle with those doubts of our own worth, we can remember Joseph. How he pushed through and did what he needed to be done. He was steadfast. And that's one of the key terms I would take away for Joseph. He was steadfast. And we should do the same. We should do the same thing. So that's one of the ways we can imitate Joseph. Another aspect of Joseph we often miss is the unique nature of his relationship with Jesus. When we think of Jesus, we tend to think of the crucifixion or his period of preaching, right? Or his resurrection. Joseph never experienced that. He died before all that happened, right? So Joseph's experience of Jesus was more as a child. I was hoping to bring a picture. One of my daughters at school painted a picture of, the assignment was paint a picture of a holy face. And suggestions were a saint or Mary or Jesus. And so she painted a picture of Jesus when he was maybe 5 or 6 years old. Just with a sly grin. And it's one of my favorite pictures because it's exactly the kind of look on my kid's face when I play hide and seek with them, or Tickle Monster, or whatever you play with the kids, right? Maybe you can think of that in your own heads, those experiences you've had with your children when you're playing, having fun with them as a child, and recognize that that was Joseph, a whole lot of Joseph's experience with Jesus. How awesome is that? He likely played hide and seek with God. Like we figuratively did that throughout our lives, but he would literally do it. Right? Tickling, goofing around, all those experiences that we have with our children, that was Joseph's experience of Jesus. That's fascinating too. Let's see, where was it? He knew Jesus more as a playful child. From what I know, most people think he probably died when Jesus was a teenager. So he probably started teaching Jesus the craft carpentry. So he knew that aspect, which if you've ever tried to teach your son to do something, it's interesting. Hopefully Joseph was way better at it than I am, because you quickly lose your temper and get frustrated and just want to do it yourself and get it done. Is often what we fall into. But he would have been patient, right? Because it's the Son of God that he's working with. Obviously, he knew there was something special about this child. This was the Messiah. But he probably had very little clue what that would be. In fact, most Jews of his day expected the Messiah to be a great leader who would liberate them from Rome, right? That was the common, very common perspective back then. Still was after Jesus. A lot of the Jews rejected Jesus because he wasn't that, right? Some even expected the Messiah to be a warrior king, right? Lead them in victory, lead them in war, go and kill our enemies. So Joseph must have had all sorts of questions about who this child was that he was raising. You know, what should Joseph, what should he be preparing him for? But just knowing Jesus and Mary must have gradually answered that for him. It's just my own imagination, but I imagine that dynamic, if Jesus is God and God is love, then Joseph would have been gradually molded, gradually learned from Jesus as a child. They must have just watched and wondered, Joseph and Mary, right? Watched and wonder time after time as their presumptions and assumptions were overcome by this child. It's often said that Mary was the first disciple, and if that's true, then I think we can safely say that Joseph was the second, right? He would have been there too, and he would have been learning. But the lessons which they learned from Jesus were taught in the everyday experience of life, of how Jesus lived, how Jesus played, how Jesus studied, how that life was lived out. In everyday experience. And remind me, do we find Jesus in our everyday experiences? When we play with our children, when we are teaching, when we are learning, do we recognize Jesus is present in that and went through that? When Jesus came to live our human experience, and he lived through all of that. And we can connect with him in all of those moments. This brings us to the importance of the home, which is the imprints of the family. It's a very common thing we focus on in Shoenstatt. God didn't have to do things the way he did. Could have done things differently. He's God. He has all power. He's free to do whatever he wants. So we can assume that what he did, especially in the life of his son, was intentional and had some value. So the fact that Jesus was born as a baby and had to be raised in a family was intentional. The fact that he was completely dependent on others for his existence was intentional. It's quite audacious that God would come as a defenseless baby, that he would allow himself to be totally dependent. He would allow himself to be weak. You know, like 30 years old before he started his ministry. So Jesus spent 30 years just living the human experience before he started thinking of it. And a large portion of that would have been just living in the family. That experience was so valuable that God, through all eternity, deemed that he would spend half of his time on earth living in the home, in the family. When you feel as a parent that your time at home is wasted or something, remember that. God didn't think it was waste. In fact, he spent far more time in the family than he did preaching. And every little experience must have been so beautiful. Seeing the Christ walk for the first time. Hearing him talk for the first time, playing catch with him in the backyard. All of those childhood experiences weren't a waste of time, but a beautiful part of Jesus' experience of our world. And Joseph would have been there to marvel at all of that. Joseph would have learned firsthand what it meant to be a child of God, and what it meant to have a childlike faith. And Joseph would have learned a great deal about love and its importance through the experience of Jesus. The lessons which Jesus went on to teach his disciples years later were likely first acted out in the home of Mary and Joseph. Blessed be the meek. Blessed be the humble. Blessed be the poor. Joseph learned these through the experience of Jesus, not through his words. One of my favorite sayings is that the way to be the father my children deserve is to become the child our Father desires. And Joseph learned that childlikeness in a deep and profound way from Jesus. With that experience under his belt, his life ended. And Joseph didn't make it to see all of Jesus's ministry and conclusion. In that state of God's loving presence in his life, through the child, he passed away. This is why Joseph is the patron saint of a good death. Because he died in the living presence of God made flesh. In the living presence of Jesus and his mother. What a way to go. Would that we could all die in such union with God. So Joseph's relationship with God was definitely unique, right? Because he was the one the Father entrusted Jesus to. And so he had that opportunity to experience love made flesh in a way that very few ever would. Now, this isn't to say that Joseph was starting out without a strong connection to God. Scripture specifically says that he was a holy and virtuous man. And his faith in God was obvious from the earliest interactions of Joseph in salvation history. First, he was betrothed to Mary. Mary is the Immaculate Conception. And so I don't think that God would have entrusted her to just any man, right? He would have had that planned out. And Joseph was a righteous and outstanding man from Scripture. He was merciful. His mercy is witnessed in his reaction to the news of Mary's pregnancy. Put yourself in that moment. Joseph had every right to be very frustrated. Betrothal was the first stage of marriage in Judaism. Often they'll say they were engaged. No, they were betrothed. That's the first step of this multiple step thing in that era of Judaism. So they were husband and wife. She just hadn't taken the step to live in the home yet. So this was his wife. And she had appeared so sweet and righteous. And now all of a sudden she shows up pregnant with a story about an angel. How do you think Joseph felt in that moment? Confused? Maybe betrayed? Heartbroken? But his reaction wasn't one of anger or revenge. He was just going to quietly end the marriage so that she wouldn't suffer. His impulse was still to protect Mary in that moment, right? And so I could just imagine how hurt he would be in that moment. And he didn't react that way. He said, how can I do this? Okay, this isn't the right place. So how do I get out of this without her being hurt? How do I still, he was still, even in that heartbreak, he was still acting out of love for her. Naturally, we know that didn't happen, right? The angel appeared to Joseph in the dream and he embraced Mary and the son. But we tend to also take that for granted too. Joseph was open to God there, right? In that moment when he's so caught up in those emotions, he wasn't so bitter or cynical or self-absorbed that he just would ignore it, right? The same was true when he was told to flee to Egypt. He didn't respond with, well, sorry, I have a project to do at work, so I can't do that right now, right? He didn't say, no, I disagree with your interpretation. I think Herod's actually a swell guy. He didn't look for excuses to avoid what God was asking him. He didn't try to come up with rationalizations to do whatever he wanted to do. No, he just got up and did what was asked. no hesitation. Joseph was a man who was open to God and willing to act according to God's will. I wonder, can we say the same thing? Am I open to God's will? Am I willing to sacrifice my own wants and needs for His will? Do I act accordingly, or do I say one thing and do another? Joseph was a man who listened to God and acted on what he heard. This should be a core takeaway from the life of St. Joseph. He's a man who is open to God and willing to act accordingly. This reminds me of a talk by one of the Shoenstatt fathers from the UK. Shoenstatt's an international movement. There's actually a strong movement in India, which is Father Pushpa was the leader of the president of Shoenstatt there in India for a while before he was transferred to the UK and then over to the United States. And so there's one priest in Scotland that I really love. I've never gotten to meet him, but I've read a lot of his work. Father Duncan. He talks a lot about fatherhood. So he speaking my language. And they did a retreat on St. Joseph. So in preparation for this, I went out and listened to every talk I could find on St. Joseph to say, what is it that speaks to me this moment? And in his talk on St. Joseph, he called out 3 core characteristics that we can imitate as fathers and as Christians. The ones he picked out were silence, obedience, and guardianship. So I'll talk quickly about these. First, silence. Isn't it interesting that Joseph isn't actually quoted as saying anything in Scripture? Didn't actually utter a word. One of the most important characters in salvation history, and he never really says anything. What he was known for in Scripture was his action rather than his words. And his love for God, Mary, and Jesus is expressed not in passionate words, but in the way he lived out his life, in the way he lived out that love. And there's a certain implication we can take from it. He was quiet and listening. He listened to Mary. He listened to the angel. And it's hard to listen if you're busy talking. So we can assume that this means his very relationship with God was one of silence. He was listening. His mind wasn't cluttered with the radio and TV and Spotify and all the things we have. Rather, he spent a lot of time doing his preparatory work, probably, in silence. Are we comfortable with silence? Sometimes it seems like we have some sort of a device going all the time. And it can get to the point where we're actually afraid of silence. Joseph wouldn't have been. And we should challenge ourselves not to be as well. Whether it's turning off the radio in the car or taking a break from the screens in the evening, there are lots of opportunities for us to find moments of silence. And then we have the opportunity to open ourselves to the voice of God, which so often speaks with a whisper. Are we listening? This is echoed in our relationship with our spouse and our children. Do we listen to them? Or are we quick to assume their thoughts and put words in their mouth? Certainly we do this with each other, and we do it with God too. I often put words in God's mouth about what's going on. Listening is the foundation of a real connection with someone. And it's the foundation of a meaningful relationship. So if we aren't listening, then we aren't really open to that relationship. So are we silent enough to hear God? The next quality he identified was obedience. Now this is often a bad word these days. It's one of those 3 evangelical councils, poverty, chastity, obedience. But it's very countercultural, especially in our modern American culture, which is a very radical individualism. So why should I value anyone else's opinion over my own? Why should I be open to what others have to say? Why should I follow any authority in my life other than my own will? This quickly leads us into a life of self-importance and self-absorption. And if the goal of our life is to find love, peace, and joy, we will not find it there. But we are too often unwilling to swallow our pride and sacrifice ourselves like Christ, including our overconfidence in our own desires and opinions. Think of the conflicts you have with your spouse. How often have you gotten stuck putting up a fight because you had to show that you were right and they were wrong? Is it really worth it? Am I just serving my ego? Glorifying myself at the expense of our love? How much more beautiful would it be if I was willing to swallow my pride and acquiesce out of love? Good thing Molly isn't here, so she can't hold to it. But no, that's what I aspire to. To say, yes, dear, even when I think I'm right. This is very clearly echoed in our relationship with God. Anytime I stray from God's will and fall into sin, I'm choosing my own will over his. I'm proclaiming myself to be in charge rather than him. And anytime we specifically choose to do something we know is wrong, or neglect to do something that we know is right, it is us falling into disobedience. In almost every moment, it seems like I'm choosing between serving God or serving myself. It's pretty clear where Joseph stood here. When the angel called, he acted. And you can bet that when Mary and Jesus had a need, he was there. Out of love. For him, their importance would have been so clearly the priority. To put himself first would have been so obviously wrong that it never seemed to enter his mind. He continually acted out of love for them. And it was a constant witness to his love for God. Is our sacrifice for our spouse and children a similar witness of our love for God? Finally, the last characteristic Father Duncan called out was guardianship, which is really where I started the talk, and to some degree where I ended. He was the protector. He was the defender. He was constantly watching out for Mary and Joseph in the same way that God watches over us and takes care of us in his divine providence. Joseph watched over and cared for his family. This is the essence of a loving father. And Joseph was a reflection of the loving Father in heaven. To my brothers in Christ here, someday your children will come to the realization that God is their Father. Will the example you set enable to them to see that as a good thing? Will he be like the father who made their mommy cry? Like the father who never had time for them? The father who cared more about his work than them? The father who they were never good enough for? What image of fatherhood are you crafting for your children? We see the image Joseph crafted. The silent and obedient servant. The guardian of the family. The follower of God. Who lived in wonder at the marvels of Jesus and Mary, while gradually growing to be the first Christian father. Joseph had one of the most awe-inspiring relationships with God, and it enabled him to be one of the most important fathers in human history. If we want to be incredible parents, shouldn't we be trying to develop an awe-inspiring love for God as well? That's what I am. 45 minutes on its spot. I said 45. Questions, comments, or
Okay, and anybody has any comment to make?
or question or anything? Thoughts? Tomatoes to throw?
Oh, the two precious because tomatoes don't grow in winter. So
True.
so
Yeah,
don't
they're too
want to waste.
valuable.
Yeah,
Waste.
might puree them and use them in curries.
Yeah. But it's awesome to be here. You know, I'm very excited. Thank you so much for inviting us.
So wonderful.
To me, Shoenstatt is very similar in a lot of ways to what you guys do here. And we have a Marian image that we carry around and pass from home to home. It's a dedicated Marian shrine that goes from house to house. That started in Brazil back in the 1960s, and so we have that kind of Marian devotion where she comes into our home. The Blessed Mother comes into our home and dwells with us, becomes the mother of our home. The lead educator is how we go. I could go on about Shoenstatt, but we probably want to get to food.
Thank you, Tim. And you know, I don't have a comment about your talk except that I think there wouldn't be a more qualified person than a father of 6. Sorry, I told him it's 5.
No, yeah.
I was not counting properly. So it's incredible and a witness in its own, because like Hispanics, Indians, the Chinese, like there's a general opinion that they have traditional values, like family values, but those values, well lived, actually would make it that we were actually living out Christian values to the fullest. So we tend to identify it with our ethnicity or something, but the truth is that fatherhood is
supersedes.
Yes, the fatherhood of God is not ethnic.
Yeah.
So
And it's a witness to Father that you can really go to any traditional culture in the
Yes.
world and find that same presence of
yes,
the love for the Father, the deference to the Father, and that is an echo of our relationship with God. Right? God designed it that way.
yes, the Trinitarian
Yeah.
aspect. And so I so desire that we have a retreat or something. We have more men coming and then more women coming. But we have to be grateful that we have gotten together like this. And the amazing children and the parents who held them, not a single disturbance. And I cannot laud that enough. So we should clap for the kids.
Yeah, right.
Quickly, so thank you, and Francis is one of our members, and
thank
he,
thank you.
yeah, a little something from
Thank
on
you.
behalf of the parish and us.
Thank you.
So thank you for that time and for putting it together in the middle of your very busy move.
Yeah.
So, all right, in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, amen. Emmanuel, Mary, your praises we sing. You reign now in splendor with Jesus our King. Ave, Ave, Ave Maria. Ave, Ave Maria.